For anyone who's on right now, thank you and welcome. And we'll get started in just a minute here. There was a lot of interest in this, so I do just want to give people a couple more minutes to get here. Here we are to talk about shellfish nitrogen and the health of our coastal waters with Josh Reitsma from Cape Cod Cooperative Extension and the Woods Hole Sea Grant Program. And during Josh's presentation, you will be muted. Please feel free to post your questions in the chat as they may come up, and we'll do our best to address them at the end of the presentation. But we want to give Josh our undivided attention during his short presentation. This webinar runs from 6:30 to 7. We may run over with questions, as is often the case. So buckle up.
All right.
All right. I'm just going to mute everyone here, and I'll formally introduce you. And we are recording. Great. So welcome, everyone. There's a number of new faces here tonight, which is terrific. We had 58 people registered. Hopefully folks will join us along the way. For anyone who does miss the opportunity to join our webinar tonight, I will do my best to get the link for the recording out to everyone. So if you have a friend who couldn't make it tonight, you could let them know. Once again, I'm Tyler Maycath with the Dennis Conservation Land Trust, and I work here part-time along with Harwich Conservation Trust. I am the Stewardship and Outreach Coordinator, and for the past several months during our unfortunate public health circumstances, we've been running these webinars for everyone as part of a monthly webinar series. So I'm pleased to welcome Joshua Reitsma, Fisheries and Aquaculture Specialist from Cape Cod Cooperative Extension, Woods Hole Sea Grant. The Cape Cod Cooperative Extension is the public education department of the Cape Cod Cooperative Extension. So it's part of the UMass system in a way, and yet it's also part of Barnstable County government. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Josh, and he's gonna provide us with some very interesting information about our imperiled estuaries and what chances that we might have to alleviate some of that pollution with using shellfish.
Thank you, Tyler. And yeah, it's always great to see people interested in, the health of our coastal waters. And yeah, what I'm going to go over today is a little bit about shellfish and nitrogen and how they interact with our coastal waters and how they affect or have the potential to affect the health of it. And it's all stuff I've sort of learned along the way as a regional fisheries and aquaculture specialist, getting involved in an advisory type role with a number of projects around to learn more about this whole interaction of shellfish, nitrogen, and the coastal environment. So with that, I'll try to get going here. So why are we discussing shellfish and nitrogen? Nitrogen really isn't a bad thing. If you read the papers on the Cape, it sounds like it's a bad thing, but really it's a vital element or nutrient for our coastal waters. But what happens is too much of a good thing and bad stuff can start happening. I try to tell my kids, don't eat too much candy or bad stuff can happen. And it's sort of a similar analogy. With too much nitrogen, you get what they call eutrophied waters or eutrophication. And really what that is just too much organic matter in the environment, and the system sort of gets out of equilibrium. And that organic matter is fueled by nutrients. And, some of the things you see are these algal mats, dense algal blooms. And overall, what happens over time is as the system gets overwhelmed, the habitat becomes degraded for various life forms that used to be able to habitate these coastal waters. So that's what we're all sort of trying to avoid with too much of nitrogen in these waters. And it's not just on the Cape where this is a problem. It's estimated that 40% of US water bodies, whether it be lakes, rivers, or coastal waters, are impaired by nutrients in some form. What is somewhat unique to the Cape, not completely unique, is almost all of that is from septic or wastewater. And, you know, you look at other areas that have problems similar, you know, eutrophied waters, the Chesapeake Bay, a lot of that is agricultural runoff, you know, providing those nutrients to the system. But given our sort of peninsula and sort of what is on our peninsula, it's us polluting those waters. It's the human population expanding and putting more, you know, wastewater into the groundwater that enters the coastal waters. So we are really to blame for our own problems. And, you know, again, what you generally see are excessive algal blooms, whether it be seaweed or the microscopic phytoplankton in the waters. And a lot of what you see is initially the loss of eelgrass. There's less light penetrating through the water column so that eelgrass can't hack it anymore. And then these excessive algal blooms will, you know, decay into that black muck that we see in a lot of coastal environments now. You know, in the picture on the bottom right there is a decaying algal mat, and you can see the sort of black, nasty muck that is around the foot of the person there in the water. So this is a little bit of a complicated diagram, but I'm not going to belabor it. But really what the point is it shows the cycle of nutrients in the system and how bivalves or shellfish, oysters or clams are bivalves, filter feeding bivalves, how they interact with the nutrient system. So we have nutrients entering up here in the upper left. They dissolve in the water. The phytoplankton or the microscopic plants consume them, the nutrients, and bloom. And the bivalves, filter feeding bivalves, really love to eat that. So they're in a good spot when, you know, they have excessive blooms to a degree. And when those bivalves are then harvested, some of those nutrients can then be removed from the water. So, you know, that's what we're looking at here. That's what that rake is sort of signifying. And most efforts have sort of focused on that harvest of bivalves from the water to remove nutrients from the system. But there are these other forms. So you see that biodeposits box here. Really what that is oyster or clam poop that settles on the bottom, and microbes decompose it and provide these alternative routes of release from the water column, whether it's burial or release as a gas. So it's a complicated system, but that's my attempt to simply explain it to the best of my ability. Happy to try to explain it further if need be. And, you know, before we go on, it's sometimes good to just sort of question what would happen if we didn't have bivalves or filter feeding animals in the water in general. And, you know, it speaks to the ecosystem services they provide. Because really what happens is you have unchecked growth of phytoplankton because you have more and more nutrients entering the system, more and more feed for these phytoplankton, and they will just grow and grow until the nutrient becomes limiting or something else becomes limiting, and then they will die and decay and cause that habitat degradation that we're talking about. So it really is an ecosystem service of those filter feeders. And when you talk about using shellfish to address nitrogen pollution, it's helpful to sort of have this reminder that they're not sponges of nitrogen. So you don't put an oyster or a clam in a bay and then take it out the next day and it's sort of absorbed nitrogen from the environment. Really what it is a lifetime of filter feeding in that environment. So I'm sort of trying to designate here with this figure on the bottom where they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger is, as the animal is living in that environment and filter feeding over the course of its life, it accumulates more and more nutrients from the environment in its actual tissues. So it's not an instantaneous type thing. It's a slow accumulation of nutrients from the environment due to its normal feeding on the algae, which has in turn fed on the nitrogen. So it's really a lifetime of service. So an accumulation of nitrogen over the life of the animal. So very quickly, one of the first things we did, a number of years ago now, is just sort of look at what is in locally harvested shellfish. We specifically looked at quahogs and oysters from a number of regions around the area. You can see from this map here that we tried to get a sort of a robust sample from all around the area. And the reality was there was some variability in what was in the animals, but the biggest predictor of how much nitrogen a quahog or an oyster would have is the size of the animal at harvest. And then there's some seasonal variation as well as source variation, but in general, the range was about 0.2 to 0.3 grams of nitrogen in an adult shellfish being harvested. So not a whole lot of nitrogen in any given single animal. And this was published. If you want to read a pretty boring scientific paper, it's open access. You can click that link when you have the opportunity. And then, just to understand where the nitrogen is in the shellfish. So nitrogen is predominantly ending up as protein in these animals. So the vast majority of protein is in the meat. So shellfish have, a hard outer shell that is mostly calcium carbonate, does not have a lot of protein in it. So the majority of the protein or the nitrogen is in the actual meat or the tissues. And these pie charts here at the bottom are just showing you that, it's anywhere from 2/3 to 75% or 3/4 of the nitrogen in the entire animal is in the tissue, even though it's probably a much smaller weight compared to the weight of the shell. But most of it is in the actual soft meat tissues. And just to put it in perspective, it takes roughly 3,600 oysters to make up a kilogram of nitrogen, or 4,500 quahogs. So the attraction to shellfish, why are they even being discussed for nitrogen management, on a region-wide basis? And they are in the 208 plan, which is sort of this region-wide sort of approach to getting at nitrogen mitigation. And the reality is they're seen as a cheaper alternative to sewering or, individual update of septic systems, the main sources of the nitrogen issues that we have. They're also seen as providing quicker results. You can put them in the water and, they go to work, and you'd expect to see results at some point in the near future rather than, a 20-year infrastructure project with sewering that, affects the groundwater, which has, 15, 20-year life to get to the actual coastal water body. So potentially quicker results, and depending on the way it's approached, it could create jobs and economic opportunity. And it's also seen as having less infrastructure. You're not putting pipes in the ground, though production of shellfish definitely does require infrastructure, especially at scale. So the remaining question is, will it work as planned? And I'll go over a few examples of where things are with some projects and where this all stands. So, some of the early conversations were, can we just credit existing shellfish growers? We have 300 to 400 shellfish farms here in the state of Massachusetts, and, that's a lot of activity. Why not just credit them? The challenge there becomes not every growing area needs a nitrogen reduction, or there are not farms where we need nitrogen reduction. There can be other water quality parameters that prevent farms from operating in some of the most impaired waters. And some of the conversations also led to, if some growers are paid for this nitrogen crediting and others aren't, are they getting an unfair advantage? Or is it, an unfair subsidy for some? So it's got its challenges on that side. So a lot of efforts have focused on municipal control of the shellfish production. The reality is the municipalities want the credit for the nitrogen reduction, so they really want control over what is being propagated and then removed from the environment to get that potential shellfish or nitrogen reduction. So it becomes a question of, do you trust the growers to do it exactly as you wanted, or can you put some sort of plan in place to make sure that you're getting exactly what you want, when the reality is growers grow to market, and their farm is dictated to what the market wants, what's going to be sold. So it's kind of a different logic when you're looking at growing for nitrogen reduction. So I had these numbers from Swan Pond, a Dennis coastal water body, from a presentation years ago, and I'm not sure how accurate they are, but it gives you some sort of frame of reference as to how many shellfish it takes. So the Mass Estuaries Program estimates that 12,000 kilograms need to be removed from the system a year. So if you were going to culture oysters to get at that sort of removal, or 100% of that removal, at that 0.28 grams per oyster that we found years ago, you're looking at 43 million oysters per year being removed from that small 183 acre pond. And again, to put that, in a relative sense, the entire 300 to 400 farms in Massachusetts, shellfish farms, produced, I think it was like 49 million oysters in 2019. So basically, to clean up Swan Pond, you'd be doubling the entirety of 300 to 400 farms of production. So again, if you put that on 10%, you're still looking at over 4 million oysters. And whether that could be done in a 183 acre pond, you're probably looking at a floating array along those lines at the bottom that would cover most of the pond itself, and that has its own impact on the pond, just having all that infrastructure. And coincidentally, that is a picture from a pilot program in Swan Pond. So there was that pilot there that I think wrapped up a year or two ago, and that pilot was just culturing 150,000 oysters per year. So again, well below 1% of the potential cleanup needed for the pond. And not surprisingly, it did not produce any measurable difference in sort of the water quality sampling done related to nutrients. And interestingly, the pond was actually downgraded due to bacterial indicators within the pond, so that it became prohibited to harvest the shellfish. So that actually became a challenge for getting the shellfish out of that pond. They had to be relayed to somewhere else to actually get them harvested. So these are the sort of things you can run into with these projects, the unpredicted challenges. So Mashpee is another town that's talked about as having a big program with shellfish. They're one of the only ones that I'm aware of that have it actually approved in their comprehensive wastewater management plan. So that's that town-wide or municipal-wide management plan for nutrients. But they are required to have a plan B. So, and I should say that shellfish aren't the entirety of their program. They certainly have sewering in sections of town, but there are certain water bodies where they think shellfish can have a significant impact on the water quality of the water body. So it's the plan A in certain water bodies, and they have a plan B in case shellfish are not working over X period of time. They're doing a small amount of oysters in one river, just trying to get 10% of the load, but the majority of it is ramping up quahog production to try to get them out in these water bodies where they think they can use them to clean up And the data is still waiting on this project. There's some initial signs that it might be having a small impact, but you need a number of years, I think, going into this, with just natural environmental variability to sort of assess these programs. And they have had a lot of challenges meeting their shellfish production targets. There's just a number of challenges in getting those numbers of shellfish. And they are bringing in dump truck loads of shellfish set at times to feed into this project. I mean, it's a big project. They do their best to sink those Carolina skiffs with shellfish. So Falmouth is another area that has a pilot project in Little Pond. Again, they're looking at 10 to 20% of the load, which equates to 1 to 3 million oysters. It sort of varies depending on how much they're trying to do in a given year. They're trying to grow them for 1 year and then relay them out to other areas for harvest, because they can't be harvested from within that pond. And the costs are significant. It is a big floating array. It's very visible. They've been able to maintain, a good relationship with the neighbors. But as you get thousands of these floating bags in the water, you can imagine that, it draws the eye. So, that can be a challenge. And so far, the only results I've heard are a modest clearing of particulate nitrogen. So, a modest clearing of the water in and around this floating array of oysters. Not so much away from the farms, but, within the farms, the oysters are clearing the water to a degree, but not affecting the water body as a whole so far. And this program in particular has become unpopular with commercial farms in the state. Typically they relay the product out for a fall harvest and make it fairly easy for commercial harvesters to come in and take them. These commercial harvesters don't have anything invested in the product, so they'll take whatever price they get. And to be honest, it's pretty easy. They just fill a bushel basket and bring it to market. So what happens is in the fall, when the market tends to kind of flood on its own, it's always been a challenging oyster time of year for sales. And then you have programs like this sort of coming online and providing quick hits into, an already flooded market. The price tends to just sort of fall off a cliff, and, the commercial guys are certainly anecdotally hurt by this. There's not a whole lot of facts to it, but they are certainly pointing fingers to this as sort of causing more and more flooding of the market in the fall. Another one is in Orleans, Lonnies Pond, a very small pond off Pleasant Bay, and again, they're trying to work up to potentially getting 100% of the nitrogen load to that small pond there. And again, it's become a pretty expensive program, huge floating array of bags that's, highly visible and controversial to a degree. And, the only results to date, again, are this sort of locally reduced particulate nitrogen. So this local clearing of the water right in the vicinity of the actual floating array itself, but not much to the water body itself that I've been aware of to date. And this program has sort of been contracted out to private industry because the town sort of didn't want to manage it because they had some challenges. So speaking of challenges, there are a number. The fiscal resources needed. Certainly the town needs staff and infrastructure to scale up any sort of program. There's also a need for increased enforcement because there are potential poachers. Oyster theft has been an issue in the past. There's various predators that can sort of consume your crop. There are mortality events related to veterinary diseases of shellfish, that cause mortality in the shellfish themselves. There's storms and ice and other things that can cause mortality. The social acceptability, the use of space, thousands of floating bags, as I mentioned earlier, are highly visible, so there can be challenges there. You mentioned some of the market challenges, the flooding of the market, or even just perceived flooding of the market can be a challenge. And then overall, just sort of validating the numbers that these programs are effective has been a challenge so far. Sort of enumerating that effect is not as easy as it seems on paper anyway. So getting at that sort of market challenge, I just, wanted to put it in perspective. This is sort of shellfish aquaculture production in Massachusetts over the last 15 years or so. It's a little bit older data, but you can see it's really ramping up. So there's concern, here in Massachusetts, but then when you look at, basically any other state on the East Coast and even Canada, production is really ramping up, and specifically ramping up with oysters as opposed to other species. So there's a lot of concern about the market, and if these markets or if these states are producing at this rate and will keep producing at that rate, will we run into issues with market, especially as we have potential nitrogen mitigation projects further really expanding potential harvest going forward. And this is an area that isn't often considered with these plans. The towns really want to just remove nitrogen and get it out of there, don't really care about the economic impact, or maybe it's just not in their minds, looking down the road, but it could have significant impact to the existing commercial industry. So it's led to some thought about alternative markets. The vast majority, 95% of production in Massachusetts is to the half shell market, so the raw bar type market. We don't really have a shucked oyster market, or not market, but we don't have shucked oyster production in the state like we did, 40 or 50 years ago. This sort of market has potential advantages. The oysters don't have to be pretty. The bigger the better, which, more nitrogen in a bigger oyster in theory, because there's more protein in the animal. It also has its challenges. It's infrastructure intensive and labor intensive. And yeah, we have a number of shellfish processing plants in the state, but not much in terms of oyster potential processing. So it's something that we've sort of been looking at and trying to foster a little bit. And we did run a pilot program this fall. It was basically in response to COVID conditions on the oyster market. So basically, COVID shutting down the restaurants caused oyster markets to just tumble. And there's a lot of excess oysters on farm. So, we thought maybe we'd pilot, having them locally processed by these clam processors and get them to food banks and see, how the food banks respond to the product. And it was actually a pretty glowing success. The food banks loved the product. It was something new and different. And the clients that they had, all had good feedback to provide to it. So the reality was the food banks here took all the products we could get them, and we're asking for more. So it's one potential avenue of a potential alternative market that has a lot of logistics to be worked out. But, I think if this is ever going to be done in large scale, we probably need to think about these lines so that we're not affecting existing commercial industry. A nutrients to nutrition type program. So when you talk about food being produced by these programs, I've heard a lot over the years, these shellfish are being used to clean up contaminants so you can't eat them. The reality is we're not talking about a contaminant, we're talking about a nutrient in nitrogen that we're hoping to take advantage of, the shellfish accumulating that nitrogen over time. So it's not a contaminant, it's just a base element. And the reality is Cape Cod coastal water bodies are quite clean. We've done some testing over the years and they're all very low in potential contaminants. I'm highlighting mercury here. It's almost undetectable. We're talking very low parts per billion status. Certainly not something you want to be concerned about. But, when you look at the environment they're grown in, that's what you have to consider. And the state does a great job of sort of managing shellfish and having them only be grown in areas that are fairly clean, Do you want to be growing them in a Superfund site like New Bedford Harbor with the legacy of PCB contamination? No, you probably don't want food products coming out of there. But you know, areas just receiving too much nutrients, they're not contaminated shellfish. They're just taking advantage of a eutrophied environment. So yeah, growing shellfish in closed areas is something where you open up potential for contaminants. So, you know, heavily polluted areas with a legacy of pollution, those are the areas you want to stay away from. So the quick summary is, you know, we're still awaiting an official success story that this is an effective approach. You know, it's, you know, most of these projects are pilot projects. You know, Mashpee has taken it on as something that they're really hoping will work. But, you know, we see the role of shellfish in these plans as more and more being a stopgap measure. People, I think, are realizing more and more that there's no way we can get to the nitrogen mitigation we need without doing something about the source. So either improve septic systems or sewering are probably going to be required. It takes a lot of shellfish to have an impact, and growing that amount of shellfish has its costs and challenges for sure. And you really need to be careful about what's going to happen with that shellfish, you know, what that end disposition or market is for those shellfish. We need to think about that more. And, you know, not forget that shellfish are important in the ecosystem just for that filtering service, you know, even if we're not crediting them for the nitrogen content, they're important for that reason. And so the final thought is, I forget this fellow's name, but he is Man vs. Food, and he ate 15 dozen oysters in a sitting. So I did the math, and he ate 50 grams of nitrogen in that sitting. So that's a pretty impressive feat. So it would take 650 of us every day eating that amount to clean up Swan Pond. So just wanted to put that in perspective. If there's 650 of us that could eat like him every day and survive it financially and physically, then maybe I'm advocating for eating oysters excessively and getting this done. So that is my final thought for you all, and I'm happy to take any questions. I know this is a pretty dense topic, but I'll answer whatever I can for you folks.
Wow. Yeah, that was really interesting. Thanks a lot, Josh. And a topic relevant to Dennis, obviously. Let me get to a couple of the questions in the chat here.
Sure.
And let's see here. I'm going to allow these folks to ask these questions on camera if they would like. The first question here is from Ida. Ida, do you feel as though your question was answered? Would you like to ask your question on camera? You can unmute yourself. Okay, how about Doug Dockery? All right, well, I'll start with this first question here. What is done with the harvest if not sold for consumption? Are they dumped elsewhere? Can they just stay?
So yeah, right now, all the programs I've been aware of, they've all gone for harvest, either recreationally or commercially. I have not heard of any sort of composting or dumping of product.
Do you view composting as a possible use of this, or for, you know, amending soil? Or
I think that has its challenges too. It would certainly have to be mixed in the right way. And I think the meats would have to be removed from the shells because the shells just aren't going to compost.
Right.
You know, you have that sort of labor to get the meats out of the shells to begin with.
Yeah.
which is an added cost.
Right. Okay, the next question from Doug. How much nitrogen is sequestered in excrement compared to tissue?
Yeah, so I didn't get into that in detail, but it's quite variable how much, that sort of biodeposit related reduction is. Some reports have it as high as the actual amount in the tissues, about as high, maybe even a little bit higher. And then it really depends on the environment. In some environments, it's pretty much negligible. It's almost nothing compared to the amount in the animal itself. So it's really hard to measure, and it's variable is the short answer. But it's happening, so it is good work.
Feel free to unmute yourself. Someone's asking me. You can unmute yourself. And I've just asked all to
I just unmuted myself.
Okay, yep. Go ahead.
And I'm sitting in my car, so I'm a little dark. So my understanding is this is being considered for Georgetown Black. Is that what was on the sort of the different sites that were promoting the tonight?
There's a lot of feedback there.
You know what? Let me turn my car off. Maybe that's is that better?
That's much better, yes.
Okay, that was what was doing it. I apologize. So my understanding is that this is something potentially being considered for Georgetown Flats. Is that correct?
I'm not familiar with Georgetown Flats, to be honest.
That's in the middle of Bass River. It's on the Yarmouth side, close to the Bass River Golf Course. And I thought what I saw, maybe it was Friends of Bass River sort of promoted this as something that was being considered an aquaculture farm potentially for that area. So, but
So,
my
sorry, Joshua, go ahead.
My question's related to that based on what you said, where it seems like the effect is very localized and focal. I'll call it focalized to right around the floats. You're in a tidal river, and also it sounds like you need a lot of floating bags, which would be pretty unsightly in a river that's got a lot of boating along with potential poachers. So I'm just trying to understand the scope of the project for something like that.
So Georgiana, this is Erin from Friends of Bass River. And I just wanted to speak to that. When we advertised this to everyone, that is something that we're talking to the town about. And, obviously listening to Joshua's talk, it does mean that, perhaps that's not the right fit, but it has been in discussion because it was in discussion for the Swan River area in relation to the leaching field that's going in behind the dump. So that's sort of how the conversation came around with Friends of Bass River. It's not in process, it's a discussion for us. Okay, what can we do? People are asking us what we can do about that 3% extra nitrogen that's going to be released into the river at the site of the leaching field at the Bass River Golf Course. And so we have to consider every option, if you will. So that's why we invited everyone to attend this and listen to what Josh had to say.
No, that's helpful. Thank you. I appreciate the clarification.
Yeah, thank you very much, Erin. Go ahead, Josh.
I would just add, you don't have to grow shellfish in a floating, or you don't have to grow oysters in a floating bag. Quahogs really need to be grown on the bottom. But if the habitat is really mucky on the bottom, it's kind of your only option, which is why a lot of these programs have gone to floating systems, because you're floating above degraded habitat that you couldn't otherwise plant shellfish directly on the bottom, or you have gear sinking into the, the mucky, soft sediments. That sort of bottom has its challenges. So floating them up high is the easier approach, which is why they've done it, even though it's the most visible.
Thanks. I guess I have a couple questions myself. Maybe others are wondering about this. First of all, is a mucky bottom an indicator of degraded water quality?
Yeah, I mean, in general, it is. It's not an ideal bottom. Now, muds naturally occur in sort of these highly productive areas of marshes. It's, you know, normal to have some highly productive or highly mucky bottoms in those areas because there's just naturally a lot of productivity. But when you talk about water bodies that didn't normally have that bottom, and it's gone from, you know, a sandy sort of natural shellfish habitat to mud, certainly sometimes in the course of just a few years, yeah, that's degraded bottom.
Yeah. Thanks. The other question I had is, for anyone who's not familiar with the Vibrio bacteria, can you address what that is and if that could be a problem with these aquaculture operations?
So yeah, Vibrio is a naturally occurring marine bacteria that happens to have some strains that are potential pathogens for us, for humans that consume shellfish, and specifically it's more of a concern when shellfish are eaten raw. But it is a natural occurring, it's just out there, you know, it's one of those things that are naturally in the environment. So over the last 10 years, it's become a little bit more of an issue for aquaculturists, basically as medical technology has improved and they've sort of tracked potential illnesses, people getting sick. But it has not been a significant issue here, but it's caused more, I guess, regulation on the industry. Oysters have to be iced right away to make sure that they cool down rapidly and the bacteria is not sort of proliferating inside the animal, if it is there at all. In some cases it's not. So it is a potential challenge, but it's a manageable challenge. There's certainly safe handling that farms are employing and you know, managing the potential issue.
Great, thanks. I was just curious if, you know, growing shellfish at that kind of density would lead to a proliferation, excuse me, of the bacteria. But
No, not necessarily any more so than growing them at lower density. It's not, it doesn't affect Vibrio bacteria in that way because it's not taking advantage of the shellfish in any way. It just exists. It's just in the water, really. So.
Okay, great. Any questions before we sign off here today? All right, well, thank you very much, Josh. Certainly a fascinating topic and a very complex issue that we have with our estuaries and how we best manage them to create healthier ecosystems, both, you know, for ourselves and for all of the wildlife and our local fisheries. With that, I'll just mention that our next webinar in February is with our colleague, Emily Ray, who is in Barnstable County, AmeriCorps, Cape Cod, and she's going to talk about all of her service throughout the year. So that should be pretty interesting. And please go to dennisconservationlandtrust.org if you're interested in learning more about our land protection work and our land stewardship work. You can also find some more public events that will be happening in the near future there. Once again, thanks, Josh, for sharing your knowledge tonight. And look forward to saying hello to you in person someday.
Yeah. Yeah, we're all hoping for that.
Right. Well, take care, everyone, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Thanks so much for coming. Feel free to email me any additional questions that you have at tylerm@dennisconservationlandtrust.org. Good night.